Hi, Misha here. Let's do another airplane video. And let's go back to World War II and talk about Japanese. In the past, I've done more than one video on Japanese planes, but this year I haven't really had anything new until now. And even it's a variant. But why not look at these? I have 3 examples, different configurations, different variants, and one 72 scale diecast from Hobby Master of the Japanese Navy Type 97 carrier-based attack bomber, named, or at least nicknamed, Kenko in Japan, and named code Kate by the Allies. This is the Nakajima B5N. And I have 2 examples of a B5N2 in different layouts. One is a bomber, one is a torpedo. Well, standard bomb, you know what I mean. And this is the new one. This is a B5N1 in earlier configuration, as it would be fighting in, say, China or Indochina before Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about the history, look at the models, see how they're the same and different at the same time. Let's put the earliest version, the B5N1, on the spinny thing, because this is the newest one that I got too. In the 1930s, the Japanese military, the Navy, was all updating, refurbishing their battleships, building some new ones, and more importantly, their carriers. And what good is a carrier without attack craft? And by this point, there were new concepts and things coming out. Now, we're not quite to the point of the dive bomber. That was a little bit later. But the torpedo bomber had already proven itself. And beginning in 1932 and again in 1934, there were efforts to get a new carrier-based torpedo bomber for the Japanese Navy. This would be the B3 and the B4Y from Yokosuka, but they weren't really a success. In fact, the B4Y was still a biplane. So by 1935, the Japanese Navy really wanted a new carrier-based torpedo bomber, and they could also be used as a conventional bomber. They wanted to have a crew of 3, capable of achieving speeds over 200 miles per hour, which at that time was fast, and also considering the range. It needed to be able to have a standard flight duration of 4 hours, and hopefully that could be extended out to 7 hours if needs be. They also specified what it could carry, yada yada, the standard torpedo, of course. Wanted to be a mono-wing design, monoplane, all-metal construction. They wanted something quite modern, but it had to be able to operate from the existing carrier decks, and some Japanese carriers were pretty restrictive, so this would require things like folding wings and what have you. They would also specify 2 different models of engine the new aircraft should use. So in 1936, the normal powers that be, the normal manufacturers, design bureaus went to work, and it really came down to 2, Nakajima and Mitsubishi. And the first Nakajima prototype was ready by the end of 1936 and would take its first test flight at the beginning of 1937, Mitsubishi being about the same. The Nakajima would be the B5N, and the Mitsubishi would be the B5M. But you can guess why. Each company made a couple of prototypes, different engines, for testing, and the Nakajima proved itself quite fast. Even in testing, it achieved 230 miles per hour. Again, very good for this time. And it had a lot of innovations, like hydraulically retracting landing gear, at least the front, and hydraulically folding wingtips. The Mitsubishi design, on the other hand, was much more conventional. It had a fixed undercarriage, and you had to get out and manually fold the wingtips. The Japanese Navy thought the Nakajima was a better bet, and so selected it for full service and production, becoming that Type 97. However, because this was an important aircraft, they did order into limited production some B5Ms from Mitsubishi, just in case the newfangled N didn't work out. It was quite an advanced torpedo bomber at that time. One change that the Navy wanted, those hydraulic folding wings, let's make that a mechanical folding wing. They just weren't sure that it wouldn't gum up and, for flight deck opera. Yeah, they wanted to get rid of that. So they kept the hydraulic gear, but not the folding wings. And they went with one of the engines, and it did quite well and would cease service by 1938. So this is a model from Hobby Master of the B5N1. This would have been what served in China, 1938, 1939, and also would be stationed in Indochina, 1939, 1940. Even though it was carrier-based, early on it mostly operated from land airfields. But that's okay. It's not a small aircraft. It's over 30 feet long with a wingspan of just shy of 51 feet, but it does have those folding wings, so it can get rid of some space in a hangar. Has a crew of 3 as specified. You've got a pilot, of course. You have the middleman, who is the navigator and bombardier. He also can be an observer, like say a high-ranking official. And in the back, we have the radio man and the gunner. Speaking of gunner, speaking of defense, this didn't have much. It did not have self-sealing fuel tanks, although to be fair, in 1937, 1938, no one did. But it didn't have a lot of defensive armament either. In fact, it had one 7.7mm Type 92 machine gun in the back. It was manually fed with drums. It wasn't even a belt fed. They thought the speed would be enough. And to be fair, it was pretty quick. The production model, the B5N1, was capable of reaching 229 miles per hour, and it had a cruise speed, more fuel efficient, of about 159 miles per hour. And it could achieve a maximum altitude of a little over 24,000 feet. For a carrier-based aircraft, that's okay. Yeah, so speed. Not a lot of armor. It did have a 3-bladed all-metal propeller. Very good range and endurance. Up to 6 hours. 3 or 4, no problem. And it could carry up to about 2,000 pounds in ordnance. Maybe a little less, but yeah, including the standard Type 91 torpedo. We'll look at ordnance here in a minute. It could also carry conventional bombs. Some B5N1s would also have secondary machine guns attached to the wings if they were more in a ground attack role. But that's kind of it. It was considered successful. In fact, it kind of outshone the TBD and the Swordfish, the other torpedo bombers of the enemies of Japan in the late 30s. And so it was put into full production at Nakajima and would do well. It would be pretty much on all the carriers. And of course it was there at Pearl Harbor, where it was made quite famous or infamous. There were 145 Kates, as the Allies referred to these, at Pearl Harbor. Most were our B5N2 we're about to look at, but a handful were still the older B5N1. Even though production would switch over, the N1s were out there, and they would continue to pop up here and there throughout the war. That's because there's not a huge difference, but every little bit counts. Let's put our earlier B5N2 on the spinny thing. So, yeah, in China initially, the lack of armor and defense machine guns wasn't really a problem, but once the Chinese started fielding more capable fighters, these were being escorted by the A5M Claude, they needed to do something. Now, they could have added self-sealing fuel tanks, they could have added armor. All of that would have impacted range, though, and this was a carrier base. So what the authorities in the Navy wanted, a better engine. It was basically the difference between the N1 and the N2. Remember, they originally specified the engine that Nakajima were to use. So the N2 was introduced in 1939 and would start replacing the N1 in production that year, or 1940. No one really knows. And it would be a gradual changeover. Externally, Really, there's only one difference. Can you see it? It's with the engine. The N1 has this kind of bulbous cowling here. And the N2, thanks to the new engine, does not. It's much more streamlined. This also required some of the exhaust and stuff to be re-maneuvered. Oops, sorry about that. Now, the new engine didn't really give it much of a speed boost. Like I said, the N1 was capable of 229 miles per hour. N2 could reach 235. Likewise, like I said, the cruise for the N1 was 159 miles per hour. Cruise for the N2, so fuel efficiency, only 600, that'd be something, 161. So very minor increase in efficiency. So you might ask why? Well, there were other benefits. For one, the new engine was more reliable, more dependable, easier to work on. That's always a benefit, especially when you're out hours away from your base. For another, that change to the cowling there over the engine allowed for much greater visibility for the pilot. Always a good thing, again, especially when you're landing on a carrier. Also, the new N2 had a pretty significant improvement in its max altitude. Not normally that important for a carrier-based aircraft, but it's there. It could go well over 27,000 feet. So roughly 3,000 feet higher, not quite 3,000, but close to it, than the N1. So all around, an improved version, but it still carried the same ordnance, the same weapons, what have you. That's why they were pretty much able to serve alongside each other, and it was more of just a product improvement than an outright redesign. Pearl Harbor, and right after, that was the high water mark for this aircraft. Of the 145 used, 40 had this torpedo here, and this was a specially designed torpedo for running in shallow water harbors. And so it had wooden slats added, and its controls were adjusted. And at this time, the Japanese torpedo was much better than what America had anyway. That plus, the ships are at port, and they didn't know they were coming. The Japanese claimed a 90% success rate with these torpedoes. Who knows? Whatever. They certainly did damage, just as the Arizona. They damaged many other ships besides. That was the first wave, though. Also in the first wave, there were about 50 armed with bombs. Same 800 kilogram as the torpedo. That's what this one has over here. We'll look at in a minute. But again, it too was slightly, well, it was a special bomb. It was basically a 16-inch naval shell turned into a bomb. Powerful enough, yeah. So they kind of hit them with naval guns by a plane. And then the second wave had 55 more. So 95 had the bombs, 105 had the bombs, and only 40 had the torpedoes, but they were in the first wave, so there you go. They would only lose 5, maybe 6 at Pearl Harbor, because, again, Americans didn't know they were coming. This, plus the fact that most of the pilots already had quite a bit of experience fighting in other theaters before this, it just gave them the edge, and they would carry this on into 1942. The B5N, even though it's starting to already show its age, it still did well for the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in 1942. In fact, B5Ns were critical in sinking the Lexington and the Yorktown, and they did severe damage to the Hornet, which eventually would sink via submarine later while it was crippled. So they had success. However, they would also have failure. The Kate was used at the Battle of Midway. There were 93 of them on the carriers. Of those, only a dozen survived, so over 80 were lost. Now, that wasn't always because of the plane. Some of the carriers just went down, but sometimes it was because, again, there were no defenses, and by this point, America was alerted. The F-4 Wildcats were getting more experience, various things. So it showed what was to come. 1943, there were not really many carrier operations in the Japanese Navy, but they would fly some of these from land bases and supporting things, but it was a relatively quiet year. 1944 would be a little more activity. These would be used in June for the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and again in October for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But their age was really showing. The newer American aircraft like the F-6 was just owning it, and of course newer American torpedo and dive bombers were taking full advantage of the Japanese carriers. And by this point, all the experienced pilots were pretty much dead, so you have a lot of new recruits flying these. So losses were quite high. I should say that production would be only at Nakajima, but by 1941, it would start up at 2 other factories, and actually Nakajima would drop it off by 1942. The other factories would continue to 43, but then by that point, it was out. They were planning to replace it with the B6Y, but the Judy, this was kind of late in coming. I should say that they built just 1,149 approximately of these aircraft. Quite a large number for a naval plane at that time. The thing is, none survived today, although there was a partial wreck that was relatively recently discovered. At the end of the war, they were pretty much used for training, target tugging, kamikaze, of course, although that long range was still an asset, along with the reliable engine, so they were still used for maritime patrols, anti-sub patrols, sub-spotting patrols. So that was probably their last major use, and by this point, the Japanese didn't really have carriers, so 44, 45, they were land-based, and they were there trying to repulse the Allied recapture of the Philippines, but it didn't work out. You might have heard how World War II ended. Spoiler alert if you haven't. But that's the B5N. It, of course, didn't serve after World War II. And it's really interesting to see how an aircraft can go from the most modern to the most dated in just 5 years. Let's look at their ordnance and then wrap things up. So this one here, my earliest one, has that Type 91 torpedo. Like I said, it's about 800 kilograms, so it's the full load. But this was a good torpedo platform. Stable, fast, and they definitely showed success at Pearl Harbor, which was pretty much the heyday of their torpedo use. That and like the Coral Sea. For about a year, they operated in their traditional torpedo role. Neat. One thing I like about these Hobby Masters, you can have their ordnance on the center line and still have it on their stands. A lot of times you can't with other Hobby Master models. And of course it has opening canopy and 3 little Japanese figures that go inside. And our second one here has the big 800 kilogram bomb. Same location. They could alternatively carry 2 250 kilogram bombs. Not their full payload, but it's just kind of what they had room for. Very common for a torpedo bomber. Neat model though, neat paint job. This is in a later war configuration. These are pretty much all metal, as you'd expect from Hobby Master, with moving propellers. Of course, gear up or down. Got a tail hook in the back. Typical Hobby Master quality. And our B5N1, not only does it have the different engine, it does have a different layout. Again, like it would have been used in more of a close support role, carrying 6 little 60-pound bombs. And this is the most numerous configuration, little sets of 2 there. So yeah, I was happy it kind of came in that way. This year, Hobby Master released a couple new B5N1s after not doing so for a number of years. Even though the differences are slight, I'm a sucker for Japanese aircraft, and, well, we haven't had much new to talk about, so at least this gives me pretty much every configuration. Little bombs, big bomb, or torpedo. So there you have it. Another look at the B5N, the Type 97, the Kate. Not only is this important for Japanese history because of its role in Pearl Harbor and sinking of multiple American carriers, it's relevant in world history. But it's also showing you where Japan failed at World War II. And to be fair, they knew that, at least, well, some knew, that if they didn't win the war in 6 months, that was it. And that's where they failed. America was maybe equal or even behind, but they were able to innovate and produce new aircraft. The Japanese weren't. In 1945, they were still flying basically the same aircraft they were flying in 1940. They had new aircraft on the drawing board, like the A7M, the B6N, but they weren't ready yet. The D4Y did go into use some, but they were never able to produce them enough numbers, and by the time they had an aircraft, it usually wasn't what they needed. Kind of goes to show you when you start picking a fight. Nevertheless, I do find it interesting, including their design styling, so I felt like picking up another Kenko. What do you think? Which paint job do you like? I mean, just because I can't appreciate them doesn't mean you can't. This is Misha. Get you very soon. Next time.